Hi, welcome to episode 5 of Enigmas of the English Alphabet. In previous episodes, we saw how the alphabet evolved as a communication tool that helped knowledge become more accessible. The main idea was to make each letter represent a specific sound related to a specific mouth position, helping learning become faster and more efficient. Let's see now how the current English alphabet evolved. The first version of English, known as Old English, was the first to use the alphabet to represent the sounds of its words. Old English was related to German, as it was the language of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes who settled in England after the departure of the Romans in the middle of the 5th century. To understand how Old English evolved, let's take a quick look at how German evolved in the use of the alphabet. German scribes identified new sounds that were used in their language and not represented in the Latin alphabet. To solve the situation, they created new symbols or used vowel combinations, also called digraphs, to represent them. The German alphabet was learned almost identically to the Latin alphabet, reciting the same sounds, especially in the case of the 5 vowels. An example of this is the word schön. Schön was written first Schoen, and in this case OE represents the sound which is not the O and is not the E. In short, the German scribe largely followed the tradition of representing sounds consistently and added specific symbols to represent new sounds, making German a regular language, which means the way the word is written represents its standard pronunciation. So going back to Old English, it started using the Latin alphabet after the arrival of St. Augustine, the first Archbishop of Canterbury, who arrived in England in the late 6th century. Old English eventually added a few symbols to represent its new sounds, including the W, thorn, and win letters. Following the alphabet tradition, although probably not all the sounds of all the different dialects were represented, Old English still followed the tradition of representing one sound with one symbol. The fact that they introduced new symbols clearly indicates that the Old English scribes had analyzed their language and determined the need for the additional letters. Another characteristic of Old English is that it featured declensions, or word changes based on number and gender, that modern English has discarded. So if today in English you only have the article the, in Old English there were more articles that were used based on number and gender. Now, these changes or declensions on words exist in most Indo-European languages, but have been discarded in England. We see then that Old English was a regular language, where each letter or combination of letters represented a particular sound. Old English lasted as an official language until 1066, when the French Normans invaded England. The Norman invasion caused French to replace English eventually as the main language in the courts, government, and educational institutions. But French, despite being a Romance language due to the origin of its words, French is characterized by the use of different sounds, especially vowels, which are not the same as used in Latin. Let's see how French evolved and changed the rules of the Latin alphabet to adapt the representation of its sounds. French scribes tried to keep the words as close as possible to their Latin origins, but used vowel combinations or digraphs eventually to indicate the new sounds. Now let's consider three French words and see how they depart from their Latin pronunciation. I apologize if I am not speaking French correctly, since I really do not speak that language. I only know enough to understand the differences in sound representation. If you want to listen to the correct sound, I suggest you go to Google and check the actual sounds. I'm going to start with the word moulin. Moulin comes from Latin molinum, and it's written M-O-U-L-I-N. Now, if we followed the Latin rules, we would read moulin, but in French, this is pronounced moulin. We see that the O and the U represent a sound that is kind of in between, and then the I seems to represent almost an A. At least it sounds like an A to me, or close, but it would be moulin. Moulin means mill or windmill. Another word of French that we're going to look at is autre. Autre comes from Latin alter, but it's written A-U-T-R-E, means other. In this case, the A and the U represent a sound similar to an O, so and then the T and the R, the E, basically is not pronounced or converts into a schwa. We have another word, which is written E-A-U, and we see here a combination of three vowels which represent a different sound. If we were to read this as Latin, we would say eau, but in French this is pronounced which is very close to the sound of a schwa. Now, in the preface of the Dictionary of the French Academy of 1694, we can see an interesting discussion about orthography that indicates how the French stopped using the principle that orthography is a technique used to represent the sounds of words. It first says that the French dictionary has stuck as much as possible to the original spellings of the Latin words, since they are the origin of the words and it is how the men of letters have received them. Then it tells us that the common usage in a living language is what guides us in how to write a word, and that this renders useless the efforts of those who tried to reform the orthography of French for 150 years before the first edition of the dictionary. These efforts were made under the principle that writing should represent the pronunciation, but the French dictionary tells us that this principle is not absolutely true. But if they say that common usage is the final guide to how a word should be spelled, then why wouldn't the spelling of a word change to reflect its pronunciation? Why should we maintain a script that expresses how a word was pronounced hundreds of years ago and does not reflect how it is pronounced today? In my opinion, yes, as a means of communication, the writing of a word should give enough information to the reader to be able to pronounce it without ambiguity or interpretation, and not be a kind of an archaeological relic for the study of scholars. This philosophy, unfortunately, influenced English, where we can see today many words that are written the way they were pronounced hundreds or thousands of years ago, and not how they are pronounced today. However, this French philosophy apparently changed over time, and the Académie Française introduced other reforms in its writing to reflect the new pronunciations, including the use of diacritics and digraphs. Learning to read French today involves understanding a considerable number of rules and exceptions in its spelling. However, once these rules are learned, there is a certain consistency in the writing of most words, so it is not necessary to indicate the sound of each word separately in the dictionary as English does. Due to the influence of French, English stopped using its additional letters and began to use only the letters of the Latin alphabet, which are used today, except for the W. Not being used by the ruling classes, English ended up being transmitted orally outside the cities, and according to Mariapay, only about 6,500 words of the language survived this period, although this came to form the core of Middle and Modern English. When it was retaken as the language of the kingdom around the year 1115, English had been completely transformed, taking many words and sounds from French. This was a situation where Middle English started, and the writers did not have an agreement on how to represent the new words that were being introduced constantly into the language. Sometimes they followed French rules, sometimes they followed Latin rules, and others they simply invented their own rules. It was common to see the same author spell the same word differently in the same book, and sometimes in the same paragraph. Shakespeare himself wrote his name in several different ways, none of which is the current version of Shakespeare. In this time of change, the process called the Great Vowel Shift arose, which caused a change in the pronunciation of long vowels. It is at this time that the A stopped being A and became A. As a result of this, the English alphabet changed from A, B, C to A, B, C, or from A, E, I, O, U to A, E, I, O, U, departing from the tradition of the alphabet of having a letter represent a single sound, since A is a combination of sounds. It is the only major European alphabet in which vowels are pronounced this way in its alphabet. If you do an experiment and you show a letter A to different people from different countries, and you ask them to tell you what this is, you ask a German, he will say ah. You ask a French, he will say ah. You ask a Spanish person, he will say ah. You ask an Italian person, and he will say ah, etc. But if you ask an English person, he's the only one who would say A. In the next episode, we will review the history of the Great Vowel Shift and other vocalic sounds of English, and how, to date, they represent a source of confusion for the English language learner. Thank you.